On a cloudy late afternoon, the small town seemed suspended in silence. A police officer walked toward the abandoned lot, where the rusty fence barely stood. Behind the wire, a black horse, thin and marked by neglect, remained motionless. The officer's approach makes the animal stomp its hooves, a dry warning. From the sidewalk, an elderly woman appears in slow steps, watching without blinking. The officer takes a step back, but the old woman crosses the rusty gate without hesitation. Her wrinkled hand slowly rises to reach the horse's rough mane. And the instant the touch happens, no one dares to breathe. Love stories with animals? Then sign up now and don't miss any. Thank you for following us. Now back to our story. The afternoon sky hung heavy with gray clouds over the small town of Millbrook, Kentucky, as if the very air carried secrets too heavy to bear. Along Maple Street, where white picket fences usually told stories of peaceful lives, there stood an abandoned lot that had become the source of endless whispers and worried glances. In the center of that neglected piece of land, a magnificent black horse wandered aimlessly, his coat dull and his ribs showing through what had once been a proud, muscular frame. Sarah Matthews paused her afternoon walk, her grocery bags hanging heavy in her hands as she watched the animal from across the chain-link fence. The horse's eyes held a depth of sadness that seemed to pierce straight through her heart. Yet there was something else there too, a wildness, a defensive anger that kept everyone at bay. She had heard the stories, of course, everyone in Millbrook. "And that horse has been there for weeks now," said Mrs. Henderson, Sarah's elderly neighbor, approaching with her small terrier on a leash. "Poor thing looks half-starved, but nobody can get near it. Tommy Wilson tried last week with some hay, and that animal nearly took his head off." Sarah nodded, unable to tear her gaze away from the horse. There was something about the way he carried himself, even in his weakened state, that spoke of a noble past. His movements, though labored, retained an elegance that suggested he had once been magnificent. The white star on his forehead caught what little sunlight filtered through the clouds, and Sarah found herself wondering about the life that had led him to this forgotten corner of their quiet town. "Has anyone called animal control?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer would disappoint her. Mrs. Henderson shrugged, her expression troubled. "Oh, they've been out here plenty of times, but that horse won't let them within 10 feet. And there's talk," she lowered her voice conspiratorially, "that he belongs to someone with influence, someone who doesn't take kindly to interference." As if summoned by their conversation, the horse lifted his head and looked directly at Sarah. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, their eyes met across the distance. Sarah felt an inexplicable pull, a recognition that made no logical sense yet felt as real as the beating of her own heart. The horse took a tentative step toward the fence, his nostrils flaring as if trying to catch her scent on the wind. "Well, I'll be," Mrs. Henderson whispered. "I've never seen him approach the fence like that before." Sarah set down her grocery bags and moved closer to the chain-link barrier. The horse's ears pricked forward with interest rather than alarm, and he took another careful step in her direction. This was unprecedented. Everyone in town knew that the black horse was aggressive, unpredictable, dangerous. Yet here he was, moving toward her with something that almost looked like hope in those dark, expressive eyes. "Easy, boy," Sarah said softly, her voice carrying the gentle tone she had used with frightened animals throughout her childhood on her grandmother's farm. "I'm not going to hurt you." The horse stopped just a few feet from the fence, his head tilted slightly, as if he were listening not just to her words, but to something deeper. A quality in her voice, perhaps, or a scent that triggered some distant memory. Sarah could see the evidence of neglect more clearly now, the way his coat had lost its natural shine, the healing cuts on his legs, the way he favored his left front hoof. Behind her, she heard Mrs. Henderson gasp. "Sarah, honey, maybe you should step back. That animal is unpredictable." But Sarah found herself reaching slowly toward the fence, her fingers extended in a gesture of peace. The horse watched her movement with intense concentration, and for a moment she thought he might bolt. Instead, he stretched his neck forward and allowed his nose to come within inches of her fingertips, separated only by the metal links of the fence. "Hello, beautiful," she whispered, and the horse's ears flickered forward. There was intelligence. In his eyes, a spark that spoke of a sharp mind, trapped in circumstances beyond his control. Sarah had grown up around horses, had learned to read their moods and temperaments, and what she saw in this animal was not aggression, but profound loneliness and mistrust born of mistreatment. The sound of approaching footsteps made both Sarah and the horse turn their heads. Officer Jake Morrison, Millbrook's youngest police officer, was walking toward them with the measured gait of someone who had seen this scene play out before and expected it to end badly. "Ladies, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the fence," Jake said, his voice carrying the authority of his uniform, but tempered with genuine concern. "This animal is considered dangerous. We've had multiple complaints about aggressive behavior." Sarah looked back at the horse, who had retreated several steps at the appearance of the uniformed officer. The transformation was immediate and heartbreaking. The brief moment of connection they had shared evaporated as the animal's defensive barriers slammed back into place. "He doesn't seem dangerous to me," Sarah said quietly, though she did take a step back from the fence. "He seems scared." Jake's expression softened slightly. "Maybe so, ma'am, but scared animals can be the most dangerous of all. We've had complaints from residents, and there's been pressure from—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "From certain parties to have this situation resolved quickly." "What kind of resolution?" Mrs. Henderson asked sharply, her protective instincts for all creatures, great and small, evident in her tone. "That's still being determined," Jake replied diplomatically, but his expression suggested that the options being discussed were not particularly humane. Sarah felt a surge of protective anger rise in her chest. She looked back at the horse, who was now standing at the far end of the lot, watching them with wary intelligence. Something about his posture, the proud arch of his neck despite his obvious suffering, reminded her of something she couldn't quite grasp. A memory that danced just beyond her conscious reach. "Who does he belong to?" she asked suddenly. Jake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's complicated, ma'am. There are ownership disputes and, like I said, some influential parties involved. Best thing for everyone is to let the proper authorities handle it." But as Sarah gathered her grocery bags and prepared to continue her walk home, she found herself unable to shake the image of those intelligent, pain-filled eyes. There had been something in that brief moment of connection, something that felt almost like recognition. As she walked away, she could feel the horse watching her, and she made a silent promise that somehow, some way, she would find out more about the magnificent creature trapped in that abandoned lot. The clouds overhead grew darker, threatening rain, but Sarah's mind was already racing with possibilities. She had connections in the local horse community. From her childhood, people who might know something about a black horse with a white star and the bearing of a champion. Tomorrow, she decided, she would begin making some calls. Tonight, she would do some research. Behind her, Jake Morrison watched Sarah Matthews disappear around the corner with a mixture of admiration and concern. He had seen good people get hurt when they tried to interfere with forces beyond their understanding, and something told him that Sarah Matthews was exactly the kind of person who wouldn't back down from a fight, especially when it involved an animal in need. Sarah spent the evening in her small living room, surrounded by old photo albums and her laptop computer. The rain that had threatened all afternoon finally began to fall, creating a gentle rhythm against her windows as she searched through memories she had not revisited in years. Her fingers traced over faded photographs of her childhood summers. At her grandmother's horse farm in Montana, images that suddenly seemed incredibly important. There, in a yellowed photograph dated 15 years earlier, she found what she was looking for. A picture of herself as a teenager, grinning widely, as she stood next to a beautiful black colt with a distinctive white star on his forehead. Her heart nearly stopped as the memory came flooding back with crystal clarity. Thunder, she whispered to the empty room, the name falling from her lips as naturally as breathing. She remembered now. The summer she had turned 16. The last summer she had spent at Grandma Rose's ranch before college, and life had pulled her in different directions. Thunder had been born that spring, and Sarah had been there for his first wobbly steps, his first taste of solid food, his first tentative interactions with the world. She had named him Thunder because of the storm that had raged the night he was born, and because of the power she could see even then in his compact young body. Her hands trembling slightly, Sarah reached for her phone and dialed a number she still knew by heart, despite the years that had passed. Rose Meadow Ranch, this is Miguel speaking. Miguel, it's Sarah Matthews. Is my grandmother available? There was a pause, then the warm voice of the ranch foreman who had been like a second father to her during those summer months. Sarah, what a wonderful surprise! Rose will be so happy to hear from you. Hold on, I'll get her. While she waited, Sarah stared at the photograph, remembering the countless hours she had spent training Thunder, teaching him to accept a halter, to follow her lead, to trust human touch. He had been exceptionally intelligent, even as a foal, with an independent spirit that had both charmed and occasionally frustrated her. Sarah, honey, is that really you? Her grandmother's voice still. Strong at 78, filled with the warmth that had made those childhood summers magical. Hi, Grandma. I know it's been too long, but I need to ask you about something important. Do you remember Thunder, the black colt that was born the summer I turned 16? There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Rose spoke again, her voice was heavy with an emotion Sarah couldn't immediately identify. Oh, sweetheart. Why are you asking about Thunder? I think I found him, Grandma, here in Kentucky, in terrible condition. But I need to know. What happened to him after I left for college? Rose sighed deeply, and Sarah could picture her grandmother settling into her favorite armchair, preparing to tell a story that clearly held painful memories. That's a long and complicated tale, honey. After you left for school, Thunder grew into the most magnificent horse I'd ever raised. He had everything: speed, intelligence, beauty, and that special spirit that made him stand out from all the others. Sarah waited, sensing there was much more to come. A man came to the ranch when Thunder was about 3 years old, Rose continued. Richard Blackwood was his name, and he claimed to be a legitimate horse trainer and competitor. He had money, credentials, and he made an offer I thought I couldn't refuse. Times were getting hard on the ranch, and the price he offered for Thunder could have kept us going for 2 years. Sarah's heart sank. She had heard of Richard Blackwood even here in Kentucky, a man known for his successful stable, but also rumored to be involved in more questionable activities in the horse world. Grandma, what exactly did Blackwood do with Thunder? At first, everything seemed legitimate, Rose explained, her voice growing more troubled. Thunder was entered in competitions, and he won almost everything. He was a champion, Sarah, just like we always knew he could be. But then, her voice trailed off. What happened? I started hearing rumors about private events, unsanctioned competitions, where wealthy people would bet enormous sums on horse races. Thunder was apparently Blackwood's prize asset in these underground circuits. When I tried to investigate, Blackwood cut off all communication, I hired a lawyer, but Blackwood had powerful connections and deep pockets. Sarah felt a surge of anger mixed with heartbreak. The playful, trusting colt she had raised and loved had been sold into a world where he was valued only for what he could win, not for the magnificent soul she had glimpsed in those early months of his life. Did you ever find out what happened to him after that? About 5 years ago, Miguel heard through his connections that Blackwood's operation had been investigated by federal authorities. Nothing was ever proven in court, but his stable was disbanded and his horses were sold off to pay debts. Thunder just disappeared after that. Sarah closed her eyes, imagining the journey that had brought Thunder from her grandmother's loving ranch to that abandoned lot in Millbrook. No wonder he was so defensive, so unwilling to trust. No wonder he had looked at her with such a mixture of hope and fear. "Grandma, if I could prove it's really Thunder, would you help me get him back?" Rose's voice was firm and determined when she answered, "Sweetheart, if that's our Thunder suffering in some abandoned lot, you can count on me to do whatever it takes to bring him home. I've regretted selling him every day for the past 12 years. After hanging up with her grandmother, Sarah sat in the quiet of her living room, processing everything she had learned. The rain continued its gentle percussion against her windows, and she found herself planning her next moves. She would need to verify that the horse in the lot was indeed Thunder, which meant she would need to find a way to get close enough to examine him properly. More importantly, she would need to find out exactly who claimed ownership of him now and what their intentions were. Officer Morrison had mentioned influential parties and ownership disputes, which suggested that the situation was more complicated than a simple case of animal neglect. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the rain having washed away the previous day's oppressive atmosphere. Sarah arrived at the abandoned lot early, bringing with her a bag of carrots and apples, along with a camera to document Thunder's condition. She was not surprised to find she wasn't alone. A small group of concerned residents had gathered across the street, watching the horse with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. "You're the lady from yesterday," observed Tom Wilson, a middle-aged man Sarah recognized from the local hardware store, the one who got close to him without getting bit. "I have some experience with horses," Sarah replied diplomatically, though her heart was pounding with anticipation as she approached the fence. Thunder was standing in the morning sunlight, and Sarah could see his condition more clearly now. Despite his obvious neglect, his basic conformation was unmistakably that of a champion. His legs were long and strong, his chest deep, his head beautifully shaped with intelligent eyes and perfectly formed ears. Even malnourished he carried himself with an innate dignity that spoke of noble breeding. "Easy, Thunder," she said softly, using his name for the first time. The horse's head snapped up immediately, his ears pricking forward with sharp attention. He took several quick steps toward the fence, his nostrils flaring as he processed both her voice and her scent. Sarah's heart soared. His reaction confirmed what she already knew in her heart. "You remember me, don't you, boy?" she whispered, reaching into her bag for a carrot. Thunder approached the fence cautiously, but with none of the aggressive posturing the townspeople had described. He accepted the carrot gently, his soft lips barely touching Sarah's palm as he took the offering. For a moment, their eyes met again, and Sarah saw recognition flickering in those dark depths. Behind her, she heard murmurs of amazement from the gathered crowd. Tom Wilson was speaking in hushed tones to another man, and Sarah caught fragments of their conversation about the horse's unusual behavior and someone named Blackwood, who was expected to arrive in town soon. The mention of that name sent a chill down Sarah's spine. If Richard Blackwood was indeed coming to Millbrook, it meant that Thunder's situation was about to become much more complicated and dangerous. Richard Blackwood arrived in Millbrook like a storm front, imposing, unavoidable, and leaving everyone in his wake feeling unsettled. Sarah first became aware of his presence when she saw the black Mercedes SUV parked outside Murphy's diner, its tinted windows and pristine exterior standing out starkly against the modest pickup trucks and sedans that usually filled the parking lot. She had spent the morning at the lot with Thunder, gradually building trust and documenting his condition with her camera. The horse had allowed her to touch his neck through the fence, a breakthrough that had drawn an even larger crowd of curious onlookers. Word was spreading quickly through the small town about the mysterious woman who could approach the dangerous horse that had terrorized everyone else. Sarah Matthews, I presume. The voice behind her was smooth, cultured, and carried an undertone of authority that immediately put her on guard. She turned to find herself face to face with a man in his 50s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than most people in Millbrook earned in a month. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his shoes gleamed despite the dusty ground, and his smile never quite reached his calculating grey eyes. "Mr. Blackwood, I assume," Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "Indeed. I understand you've been taking quite an interest in my horse." His tone was conversational, but Sarah could sense the steel beneath the velvet. "Your horse?" Sarah gestured toward Thunder, who had retreated to the far end of the lot at Blackwood's appearance. "That animal has been abandoned here for weeks, malnourished and without proper care. If he's yours, you have a lot of explaining to do." Blackwood's smile widened, but it held no warmth. "Miss Matthews, you seem to be under several misapprehensions. First, this horse, whose name is Midnight Thunder, by the way, is indeed my legal property. I have all the necessary documentation to prove it. Second, his current condition is temporary and part of a carefully planned rehabilitation program." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. Rehabilitation program? He's been living in an abandoned lot without shelter, adequate food, or veterinary care. That's not rehabilitation, that's neglect. Sometimes, Miss Matthews, horses that have been overstimulated by too much human attention need time to readjust to a more natural environment. Thunder has been through some challenging experiences, and solitude helps him process those experiences. The way Blackwood spoke about Thunder made Sarah's skin crawl. There was no affection in his voice, no genuine concern for the animal's well-being, only the cold calculation of someone discussing a valuable asset. "What kind of challenging experiences?" she pressed. Blackwood's expression hardened slightly. "That's really none of your concern, Miss Matthews. What is my concern is that you've been interfering with my property and potentially undoing months of careful work. I'm going to have to ask you to stay away from this area." Datidil. By now, their conversation had attracted the attention of the usual crowd of onlookers, including Officer Morrison, who approached with the careful neutrality of a small-town policeman trying to navigate between local residents and someone with obvious wealth and influence. "Is there a problem here?" Jake asked, though his tone suggested he already knew there was. "Officer Morrison, I'm Richard Blackwood. I believe you've been expecting me." Blackwood reached into his jacket and produced a leather portfolio. "I have all the documentation necessary to prove my ownership of the horse, as well as permits for his current housing arrangement." Jake examined the papers carefully, his expression growing more troubled with each page. Sarah could see him struggling between his duty to enforce the law and his obvious discomfort with the situation. "Everything appears to be in order legally," Jake admitted reluctantly. "But, sir, I have to tell you, we've had numerous complaints about the condition of this animal. Maybe there's a way to relocate him to more suitable facilities." "Officer Morrison, I appreciate your concern, but as I explained to Miss Matthews, this arrangement is temporary and medically necessary. I have a veterinary expert who can vouch for the treatment program if needed. Sarah felt her anger rising. What veterinary expert would recommend leaving a horse in an abandoned lot without proper shelter or regular feeding? Dr. Patricia Hendricks from the Equine Behavioral Institute in Lexington, Blackwood replied smoothly. Perhaps you've heard of her work with traumatized competition horses? Sarah had indeed heard of Dr. Hendricks, whose controversial methods involving isolation therapy were widely debated in the horse community. The fact that Blackwood could produce credible-sounding experts made her realize she was dealing with someone who had prepared for every contingency. Miss Matthews, Blackwood continued, his voice taking on a more menacing edge. I'd like to have a word with you privately, if you don't mind. Jake looked uncomfortable. Sir, if you have concerns about harassment or trespassing, those are matters for the police to handle. Oh, nothing so dramatic, officer. Just a friendly conversation between two people who share an interest in equine welfare. Sarah wanted to refuse, but something in Blackwood's tone suggested that declining would only make things worse. Fine, but we talk here, in public. Blackwood nodded and gestured for her to step a few yards away from the crowd. When they were far enough from the others to speak quietly, his entire demeanor changed. The polished facade dropped away, revealing something much colder underneath. Miss Matthews, I've done my research on you. Sarah Michelle Matthews, age 31, works as a freelance graphic designer, lives alone in a rented house on Elm Street. Grandmother owns Rose Meadow Ranch in Montana, where you spent childhood summers. You have no criminal record, no outstanding debts, and no powerful connections. Sarah's blood ran cold. Are you threatening me? I'm simply pointing out that you're a small-town nobody who has decided to involve herself in affairs far beyond her understanding. Thunder, or whatever sentimental name you've given him, represents a significant financial investment on my part. I've spent considerable time and money acquiring him and developing his potential. His potential for what? Blackwood's smile returned, but it was predatory now. Let's just say that certain clients of mine value horses with Thunder's particular. In combination of speed, endurance, and spirit, private competitions, shall we say, with very high stakes. Sarah felt sick to her stomach. You're talking about illegal racing. I'm talking about private sporting events among consenting adults with the means to appreciate fine horseflesh. But here's what you need to understand, Miss Matthews. Thunder is worth more to me than your entire annual income. If you continue to interfere with my property, I will take legal action that will bankrupt you and anyone else who supports you. And if I don't interfere, then Thunder will continue his rehabilitation program until he's ready to return to work. Eventually, he'll be relocated to more permanent facilities, and Millbrook will return to its quiet, peaceful existence. Sarah looked back at Thunder, who was watching their conversation with obvious distress. She could see the intelligence in his eyes, the awareness that his fate was being decided by the humans around him. The thought of him being forced back into whatever hellish existence Blackwood had planned made her feel physically ill. I want to see these permits and documentation you showed Officer Morrison. Blackwood chuckled. Miss Matthews, you have no legal standing to make such demands. But I'll tell you what, if you back away from this situation now, I'll ensure that Thunder's remaining time here is as comfortable as possible. Continue to interfere, and I might be forced to move him immediately to less accommodating facilities. The implied threat was clear. Sarah realized she was trapped. Any direct confrontation with Blackwood would likely result in Thunder's immediate removal to some place where she would never be able to help him. But backing down felt like abandoning the horse who had once trusted her completely. As Blackwood walked back toward his Mercedes, Sarah remained by the fence, her mind racing. She needed help, and she needed a strategy that would protect Thunder, while exposing Blackwood's operation. Most importantly, she needed to find allies who could match Blackwood's resources and influence. Thunder approached the fence hesitantly, as if sensing her distress. When he gently nuzzled her hand through the chain link, Sarah made a decision that would change both their lives forever. That evening, Sarah sat in Murphy's diner, nursing a cup of coffee and trying to process the day's events. The confrontation with Blackwood had left her feeling simultaneously determined and terrified. She knew she was outmatched in terms of resources and legal expertise, but the memory of Thunder's trusting eyes kept her from giving up. "Mind if I join you?" Sarah looked up to find a man in his early 40s standing beside her booth, notebook in hand and press credentials hanging from a lanyard around his neck. He had the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who spent more time chasing stories than worrying about his appearance, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. "I'm Marcus Chen, reporter for the Louisville Herald. I heard about your encounter with Richard Blackwood today, and I'd like to talk to you about it." Sarah hesitated. Involving the press could help Thunder's cause, but it could also provoke Blackwood into taking immediate action to remove the horse from town. "How did you hear about it so quickly?" Marcus slid into the booth across from her. "Small towns have big ears, and Richard Blackwood's name tends to get people talking. May I?" He gestured to his notebook. "That depends on what you want to know and what you plan to do with the information." Marcus set down his pen and leaned forward conspiratorially. "Miss Matthews, I've been investigating Blackwood's operations for 3 years. What's happening here in Millbrook is just the latest chapter in a very long and very troubling story." Sarah's interest was immediately piqued. "What kind of story?" "That the kind that involves wealthy individuals with more money than conscience, horses that disappear from legitimate racing circuits, and private events where animal welfare laws are more suggestions than requirements." Marcus paused, studying her reaction. "The kind of story that's been very difficult to prove because Blackwood is exceptionally good at covering his tracks and silencing witnesses." "Why are you interested in helping Thunder?" "Because Thunder, or Midnight Thunder, as Blackwood calls him, isn't just any horse. 3 years ago, he was the favorite to win the Kentucky Derby before he mysteriously disappeared from his trainer's stable. The official story was that he suffered a career-ending injury, but I could never find any veterinary records to support that claim." Sarah felt her heart pounding. "You're saying Thunder was a Derby contender?" "More than that, he was a phenomenon, undefeated in 12 starts, with times that broke track records. Then suddenly, he was gone. His original trainer, David Rodriguez, was devastated. He claimed someone had stolen Thunder, but he could never prove it because the ownership papers were so convoluted." The pieces were starting to fit together in Sarah's mind. Blackwood must have acquired Thunder through some complex legal maneuvering, then used the horse's exceptional abilities for his private racing operation until Thunder finally broke down, physically or mentally, from the abuse. "What happened to David Rodriguez?" Marcus's expression darkened. "He became obsessed with finding Thunder, started investigating Blackwood's operation, asking too many questions. 6 months later, his stable was hit by a mysterious fire that destroyed everything, including his financial records. Rodriguez lost his training license shortly after that due to alleged financial irregularities." "You think Blackwood was behind it?" "I can't prove it, but the timing was awfully convenient. Rodriguez was getting close to something, and suddenly his life fell apart." Marcus leaned back in his booth. "That's why I need your help, Miss Matthews. You've established a connection with Thunder that no one else has been able to achieve. More importantly, you're not part of the horse racing industry, which means you're not vulnerable to the same pressure tactics Blackwood uses on trainers and jockeys." Before Sarah could respond, Officer Morrison entered the diner and spotted their table. He approached with obvious reluctance, his expression suggesting he was the bearer of unwelcome news. "Miss Matthews, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I need to inform you that Mr. Blackwood has filed a restraining order. You're legally prohibited from coming within 100 yards of his property." Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. His property? That's an abandoned lot owned by the city. According to the documents he filed this afternoon, he has a valid lease agreement for the property. I've verified it with City Hall. Jake looked genuinely pained to be delivering this news. "I'm sorry, Sarah. My hands are tied." Marcus was scribbling notes rapidly. "Officer Morrison, is it? Can you tell me about the lease agreement? When was it signed, and what are its terms?" Jake hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the press attention. "I can't discuss ongoing legal matters with reporters." "What about public records?" Marcus pressed. "Lease agreements for city property are public documents, aren't they?" "You'd have to check with City Hall about that." After Jake left, Sarah stared into her coffee cup, feeling defeated. He's thought of everything, hasn't he? Legal documents, restraining orders, leases. How can I help Thunder if I can't even get near him? "You can't help him alone," Marcus replied. "But you're not alone. There are other people in this town who care about what's happening to that horse." As if summoned by his words, Mrs. Henderson entered the diner, followed by Tom Wilson and several other residents Sarah recognized from the daily gatherings at the lot. They approached the booth with the determined air of people who had made a collective decision. "Sarah, honey," Mrs. Henderson said, "we heard about the restraining order. It's absolutely disgraceful what that man is doing." Tom Wilson nodded emphatically. "We've been talking, and we want to help. That horse needs someone to speak for him, and if you can't get close to him, then we'll be your eyes and ears." "No, that's very kind of you, but what can you do that I can't?" "Document everything," said Ellen Murphy, the diner's owner. "Take pictures, keep records of his condition, make sure everyone knows what's really happening. Blackwood might have and fooled the authorities with his fancy paperwork, but he can't fool all of us." Marcus looked up from his notes. "That's exactly what we need. A coordinated effort to document Thunder's condition and Blackwood's treatment of him. If we can build a solid case showing neglect or abuse, we might be able to challenge his custody legally." Mrs. Henderson sat down next to Sarah. "There's something else, dear. My nephew works at City Hall, and he told me something interesting about that lease agreement. It was signed just yesterday, dated retroactively to last month. That seems mighty convenient timing, doesn't it?" Sarah felt a spark of hope. "You think it's fraudulent?" "I think Richard Blackwood is very good at making legal problems disappear and legal solutions appear," Marcus interjected. "But if he's cutting corners or falsifying documents, that's our opening." Tom Wilson pulled out his phone. "I've been taking pictures of that horse every day for 2 weeks. I've got documentation of his condition before Blackwood showed up with his paperwork. If his story is that Thunder was receiving proper care, my photos tell a different story." For the first time since her confrontation with Blackwood, Sarah felt like she had reason for hope. She wasn't facing this alone. She had allies, people who cared enough about Thunder to take risks on his behalf. "What do we do first?" she asked. Marcus smiled. "First, we gather evidence. Every photo, every witness statement, every document we can get our hands on. Then we start asking the right questions in the right places. Blackwood may have money and influence, but he's not invincible." Mrs. Henderson patted Sarah's hand. "And while Mr. Chen is doing his investigating, we'll make sure that Horse knows he hasn't been forgotten. Restraining order or no restraining order, there are ways to show care that don't involve trespassing." As the group began making plans, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since her grandmother had told her Thunder's story: hope. Blackwood might have legal documents and powerful connections, but he was underestimating the determination of a small town that had decided to fight for what was right. Outside the diner windows, the sun was setting over Millbrook, casting long shadows across the streets. Somewhere in that abandoned lot, Thunder was spending another night alone, but Sarah knew that tomorrow would bring the beginning of a new chapter in their story. Sarah woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of her phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. The caller ID showed Mrs. Henderson's number, and Sarah's heart immediately began racing. No one called at this hour with good news. "Sarah, dear, you need to get down to the lot right away." Mrs. Henderson's voice was urgent but controlled. "There's a horse trailer here and men are trying to load Thunder into it." Sarah was out of bed and pulling on clothes before Mrs. Henderson had finished speaking. "Are you there now? Is it safe?" "Tom and I are across the street with about a dozen other folks. That Blackwood man is here with 2 other men and a big trailer. Thunder is fighting them something fierce, but they're trying to force him in anyway. I'll be there in 5 minutes. Don't do anything dangerous." Sarah grabbed her keys and ran to her car, her mind racing as fast as her pulse. The restraining order meant she couldn't legally approach the lot, but she couldn't stand by and watch Thunder be taken away in the middle of the night like a criminal fleeing the scene. When she arrived at Maple Street, she found a scene that looked like a standoff. A large horse trailer was parked beside the lot, its rear gate open and a loading ramp extended. Portable floodlights had been set up, turning the abandoned lot into a harsh stage where a drama was unfolding. Blackwood stood beside the trailer with 2 men who looked more like security guards than horse handlers, while Thunder reared and plunged at the end of a lead rope, fighting with desperate strength against being forced toward the trailer. Across the street, a crowd of Millbrook residents had gathered despite the late hour. Sarah could see Mrs. Henderson, Tom Wilson, Ellen Murphy, and at least 15 other people, all watching with obvious distress as Thunder fought for his freedom. "Sarah!" Mrs. Henderson called out as she approached. "Thank goodness you're here. They've been at this for 20 minutes, and that poor horse is terrified." Sarah could see that Thunder was indeed in a state of panic. His coat was dark with sweat. His eyes were rolling white with fear, and he was making sounds of distress that cut through her heart like knives. The men trying to load him were using methods that bordered on abusive, pulling on the lead rope with mechanical winches and using long whips to try to drive him forward. "This is awful," Sarah said, fighting the urge to run across the street and intervene physically. "Where's Officer Morrison?" "He's on his way," Tom Wilson replied grimly. "But Blackwood has all the legal paperwork. There's probably nothing Jake can do to stop this." As if summoned by their conversation, Jake Morrison's patrol car arrived, its red and blue lights adding to the surreal atmosphere of the scene. Jake got out and approached Blackwood, and even from across the street, Sarah could see the tension in the officer's body language. "This has got to be illegal," Ellen Murphy said angrily. "You can't just come in the middle of the night and terrorize an animal like that." Marcus Chen appeared beside Sarah, camera in hand and press credentials prominently displayed. "Actually, they can, as long as they have proper ownership documents. But what they're doing to that horse right now could constitute animal cruelty, regardless of ownership." Sarah watched in horror as one of Blackwood's men produced what looked like an electric cattle prod. "They're going to shock him," she said, her voice breaking. That was the moment Sarah's resolve finally overcame her legal concerns. Restraining order or no restraining order, she couldn't stand by and watch Thunder be tortured. She started across the street, ignoring Mrs. Henderson's calls for her to stop. "Sarah, don't! You'll be arrested." But Sarah was already halfway across the street when Thunder caught sight of her. The horse's frantic struggles suddenly stopped, and he let out a whinny that sounded almost like a cry for help. His eyes locked onto hers, and in that moment, Sarah saw not just fear, but recognition and desperate hope. "Stop," she called out as she approached the fence. "You're terrifying him." Blackwood turned, his face twisted with anger. "Miss Matthews, you are in violation of a legal restraining order. Officer Morrison, arrest this woman immediately." Jake looked torn. Between his duty to enforce the law and his obvious sympathy for Sarah's position. "Sarah, I have to ask you to step back across the street." But Thunder had other ideas. At the sound of Sarah's voice, he had stopped fighting the men holding him and was straining toward the fence where she stood. His ears were pricked forward, and he was making soft, nickering sounds that were clearly directed at her. "Look at him," Sarah called out to Jake and anyone else who would listen. "He knows me. He trusts me. Let me try to calm him down. And then, maybe we can discuss this reasonably." "Absolutely not," Blackwood snapped. "This animal is my property, and I don't need anyone's permission to transport him." "Mr. Blackwood," Jake said carefully, "if Miss Matthews can calm the horse, wouldn't that make your job easier? Right now, you're risking injury to the animal and to your men." Marcus was taking pictures rapidly, documenting everything. "For the record, Mr. Blackwood, what's your reason for moving this horse in the middle of the night? Most legitimate horse transportation happens during daylight hours." Blackwood's jaw tightened. "I don't answer to reporters. This animal needs immediate veterinary care that can't be provided in this temporary facility." Sarah felt her heart leap with hope. "Then let me help get him in the trailer peacefully. If he really needs medical attention, the last thing you want is for him to injure himself, fighting." For a moment, Blackwood seemed to consider this. Thunder had indeed stopped his violent struggling and was focused entirely on Sarah, his breathing gradually slowing from the panicked gasping of a few minutes earlier. "5 minutes, Blackwood finally said. "If you can't get him loaded peacefully in 5 minutes, we do this our way." Sarah approached Thunder slowly, speaking in the soft, calm tones she had used with him as a foal. "Easy, boy. I know you're scared, but I need you to trust me one more time." Thunder allowed her to touch his neck, his muscles gradually relaxing under her gentle stroking. But as Sarah looked into his eyes, she could see something that alarmed her more than his earlier panic. His pupils were dilated beyond what fear alone would cause, and there was a glassy quality to his gaze that suggested illness. "He's sick," she said suddenly, turning to face Blackwood. "This horse has a fever. Look at his eyes, his breathing. He needs medical attention, but not the kind that requires moving him in the middle of the night." "Miss Matthews, you're not a veterinarian," Blackwood replied coldly. "I have a qualified professional waiting to examine him at our facility." "Then bring the veterinarian here," Jake interjected. "If the horse is genuinely ill, moving him while he's in distress could make his condition worse." Sarah could see Blackwood calculating, weighing his options. The crowd across the street had grown larger, and Marcus was documenting everything. The situation was rapidly spiraling beyond Blackwood's control. Thunder suddenly staggered slightly, confirming Sarah's fears about his condition. His legs seemed unsteady, and he was breathing more rapidly than could be explained by his earlier exertion. "Please," Sarah said, looking directly at Blackwood. "Whatever your plans for him, they won't work if he doesn't survive the night. Let me call a local veterinarian. Let someone examine him properly." Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he considered his options. The crowd was getting larger and more vocal in their support for Sarah. Marcus was recording everything for his newspaper, and Thunder was clearly in no condition to be transported safely. "You have until dawn," he finally said through gritted teeth. "If he's not ready to travel by then, I'll have him tranquilized and loaded unconscious if necessary." Sarah knew it wasn't much of a compromise, but it bought her time. As Blackwood's men began packing up their equipment, she stayed beside Thunder, her hand on his neck, feeling the heat of fever radiating through his coat. She had won this battle, but the war for Thunder's freedom was far from over. Dawn broke over Millbrook with golden light that seemed to promise new beginnings. Dr. Emily Rodriguez, the local veterinarian and daughter of Thunder's original trainer, David Rodriguez, had arrived before sunrise and was conducting a thorough examination of the sick horse. Sarah stood beside her, watching anxiously as the young doctor took Thunder's temperature and listened to his heart and lungs. His fever is down, but he's severely dehydrated and malnourished, Dr. Rodriguez said quietly. The stress of last night's incident certainly didn't help, but his condition suggests weeks of inadequate care. Marcus Chen was documenting everything, and his investigation had yielded explosive results overnight. Sarah, you need to hear this, he said, approaching with his laptop computer. I've been digging into Blackwood's ownership claims, and I found something incredible. Sarah looked up from stroking Thunder's neck. What did you find? The original ownership papers for Thunder were never legally transferred to Blackwood. David Rodriguez, Dr. Rodriguez's father, still holds the legitimate title to this horse. Blackwood's documents are forgeries, very sophisticated ones, but forgeries nonetheless. Dr. Rodriguez looked up sharply from her examination. Are you saying this is Midnight Thunder, the horse my father trained? It has to be, Sarah replied. I raised him as a foal at my grandmother's ranch. He was sold to Blackwood illegally, and your father's been trying to find him for 3 years. Tears began flowing down Dr. Rodriguez's face as she looked at Thunder with new eyes. Dad never stopped looking for him. Even after the fire destroyed the stable, even after he lost his license, he never gave up hope. She placed her hand on Thunder's forehead. He's going to be so happy to know you're alive. Blackwood arrived with the rising sun, accompanied by his security team and a new addition, a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Blackwood's attorney. The lawyer immediately began making legal threats about property rights and restraining order violations. Mr. Blackwood, Marcus called out, I'd like to ask you about the authenticity of your ownership documents for Midnight Thunder. Blackwood's confident demeanor faltered slightly. I don't discuss my private business dealings with reporters. What about with federal investigators? Everyone turned to see 2 people approaching, a man and woman in dark suits with FBI credentials prominently displayed. Agent Sarah Williams and Agent Michael Torres had arrived in response to Marcus's overnight calls to his contacts in federal law enforcement. Mr. Richard Blackwood, Agent Williams announced, we have a warrant to examine all documentation related to your ownership of the horse known as Midnight Thunder, as well as evidence of your involvement in illegal gambling operations using stolen racehorses. Sarah watched Blackwood's face go pale as his carefully constructed world began crumbling around him. His attorney immediately began demanding to see the warrant and making phone calls, but the agents were already examining Thunder and taking photographs of his condition. Miss Matthews, Agent Torres approached Sarah. We understand you have a personal history with this animal. Can you help us establish his true identity? Sarah nodded and pulled out her phone, showing the agents the photographs from her grandmother's ranch. His name is Thunder. I raised him from birth, and his legal owner is David Rodriguez. Mr. Rodriguez never sold him to Blackwood. The horse was stolen. Dr. Rodriguez stepped forward. Agents, I can provide DNA samples that will prove this horse's identity. My father kept detailed records of all his horses, including genetic profiles. As the federal investigation unfolded, more of Blackwood's operation began to unravel. Agent Williams explained that they had been tracking an illegal gambling network that used stolen horses in underground races, and Thunder's case had provided the breakthrough they needed. Mr. Blackwood, Agent Williams addressed the increasingly desperate man. "You're under arrest for theft, fraud, and operating an illegal gambling enterprise." As Blackwood was led away in handcuffs, his attorney frantically making phone calls, Sarah felt a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying begin to lift from her shoulders. Thunder was safe. His true ownership would be restored, and the man who had caused him so much suffering was finally facing justice. But the most emotional moment was yet to come. Dr. Rodriguez had called her father, and David Rodriguez arrived. In Millbrook, just as Thunder was being loaded into a proper horse ambulance for transport to the veterinary hospital. The reunion between the man and the horse he had thought lost forever brought tears to everyone's eyes. Thunder, despite his weakness, immediately recognized his original trainer. He nickered softly and nuzzled David's shoulder, accepting gentle caresses from the man who had discovered his potential years earlier. "I never gave up looking for you, boy," David whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I knew you were out there somewhere, and I knew someday we'd find each other again." 2 weeks later, Sarah stood in the paddock at Rose Meadow Ranch, watching Thunder graze peacefully in the Montana sunshine. Her grandmother's ranch had become his sanctuary while he recovered from his ordeal, and the transformation was remarkable. His coat had regained its lustrous black sheen, his body had filled out with proper nutrition, and most importantly, the wariness had left his eyes. David Rodriguez had decided to retire Thunder from any kind of competitive racing, recognizing that the horse had suffered enough in his pursuit of human ambitions. Instead, Thunder would live out his days as the treasured companion he had always deserved to be. Marcus Chen's investigation had led to the exposure of Blackwood's entire network, resulting in the rescue of dozens of other stolen horses and the prosecution of multiple individuals involved in the illegal gambling operation. His articles had won several journalism awards and had led to stronger enforcement of animal welfare laws in competitive horse sports. Officer Jake Morrison had been promoted to sheriff after his role in Thunder's case demonstrated his commitment to justice over political convenience. The town of Millbrook had rallied around the cause, proving that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they stood together for what was right. Sarah spent her days working remotely from the ranch, designing graphics on her laptop while Thunder grazed nearby. The bond they had formed in those early days of his life had been tested by years of separation and hardship, but it had emerged stronger than ever. One evening, as the sun set over the Montana mountains, Sarah stood beside Thunder in the pasture, watching the golden light play across his magnificent form. He had taught her that some connections transcend time and circumstance, that love and loyalty can survive even the darkest chapters of life, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for glory or profit, but simply because they are right. Thunder raised his head from the grass and looked at her with those intelligent dark eyes, and Sarah could swear she saw gratitude there, along with the contentment of a horse who had finally found his way home. The black horse, who had once symbolized everything wrong with human exploitation of animals, had become a symbol of hope, redemption, and the power of community to protect those who cannot protect themselves. His story had ended not with tragedy, but with the triumph of compassion over greed, justice over corruption, and love over indifference. Dear friends, we hope Thunder's incredible journey from abandonment to redemption has touched your hearts as deeply as it has ours. Like Sarah, we all have the power to make a difference when we see injustice and choose to act with courage and compassion. Thunder's story reminds us that sometimes the most magnificent transformations begin with a single person willing to extend their hand to those in need. If this tale of hope, community, and the unbreakable bonds between humans and animals has moved you, we invite you to join our growing family of storytellers and dreamers. Click the subscribe button below to never miss our latest emotionally powerful narratives. Each story we share explores the complexity of life, the triumph of the human spirit, and the extraordinary connections that make our world beautiful. Your support means everything to us. Please give this video a thumbs up if Thunder's story resonated with you, and don't forget to share it with friends and family who believe in the power of love to overcome adversity. We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever encountered a situation where you had to choose between what was safe and what was right? How did you find the courage to act? Every day, we bring you new stories of hope, redemption, and the incredible bonds that unite us all. Don't miss our upcoming tales of love, courage, and transformation. Ring that notification bell and join us on this emotional journey through the most inspiring stories life has to offer. Until next time, remember that every act of kindness, no matter how small, has the power to change a life forever.